Hello, and welcome to Western Washington history. In 1841, when the Oregon Trail brought its first group of settlers over the Cascade Mountains, with more Americans in the area, it'd be more likely that America would get the land over England. But the Hudson's Bay Company of England had a strong foothold here before the Americans crossed the mountain. The first documented fur traders, though, before Hudson Bay, were those who built Fort Astoria in 1811, and they were Americans, which would help in the battle for the border. More so in the Willamette Valley at this time, as it was the official ending of the Oregon Trail. Some chose to take a right turn, though, and head up towards the Puget Sound country, many times up the Cowlitz River. At the southernmost end of the Puget Sound is a place called Budd Inlet. If you were coming into the interior Puget Sound through the Strait of Juan de Fuca by boat, it would be one of the places that would take you the longest to get to. But the first settlers were coming up from the Columbia River, so this is the first part of the bay you would hit. The inlet was named by Captain Charles Wilkes in 1841 when his expedition came through the area. They had just come from Antarctica and were noted as having been the first in modern times to find and document Antarctica. He named it Budd Inlet to honor Thomas A. Budd, who was the master of the ships Peacock and Vicennes, both ships in the expedition. The Peacock had run aground on the Columbia Bar in 1840 before reaching the Puget Sound. It broke apart, but no one died. The Puget Sound expedition commenced at the bay in Tacoma, named Commencement Bay by Wilkes. Of course, when Wilkes sailed there and named Budd Inlet, it already had a name. Were living there. They were called by a few similar names. They had villages all along the inlet, but the main village was at Tumwater Falls. They had a village at present-day 4th Avenue and Columbia Street in Olympia. There were hundreds of people in this village. The people lived in cedar plank homes. Their homes and canoes filled the shoreline. One year, Chief Sealth came with 250 of his tribe of Duwamish and stayed for the winter north of State Street and Columbia Avenue. Edmund Sylvester and Levi Smith came to the village in 1846. In 1841, Congress had passed the Distribution Preemption Act, which allowed settlers to claim up to 160 acres per person. There may have been other acts passed because Edmund and Levi both claimed up to 320 each. Levi's parcel took the entire peninsula the native village was located on. He enclosed about 2 acres for his animals and built a cabin and garden. Today, his cabin would be located at Capitol Way and Olympia Avenue. Levi wasn't married and would have epileptic seizures. After one of these seizures, it is said he would be depressed and would stay in his cabin for days. He kept a diary that has been since published. Depressed or not, Levi didn't let that stop him. He set up the rest of his parcel as a town site. It was called Smithster, which was both of their last names combined, but people moving to the area ended up calling it Smithfield. It was a good location positioned at the end of the Cowlitz Trail, the trail that brought people to the Puget Sound from the Columbia River at the end of the Oregon Trail. It was a route used to get to the Sound before Military Road 1 or Natchez Pass was built in 1854. If you'd like to know more about that road, I made a video about it and the link will be in the description. Edmund Sylvester's land was on the edge of Chambers Prairie, but Sylvester helped Levi build the cabin, and that would become the first home in Olympia. They shared the cabin as they prepared a town site. England and the United States came to an agreement in 1846. They moved up to where the Canadian border is now. The very next month, January 1847, more settlers showed up, and that continued for a while. Some of these families used the burned-out trunk of trees as a shelter until they were able to build a cabin. 1847, a sawmill was built in Tumwater. In 1847, a sawmill was built in Tumwater with some investors from Smithfield like Edmund Sylvester. They leased part of Tumwater Falls from Michael T. Simmons, founder of Tumwater, or New Market as it was then called. More on that later because Tumwater, as you have guessed, is for another video. Levi Smith was elected as Oregon Territorial Legislative Representative for Lewis County in 1848. The area at the time was part of Lewis County. He was on his way to Tumwater in his canoe when he had a seizure. He flipped the canoe and drowned. He had not even taken off his yet. Edmund Sylvester now became owner of Smithfield. When the two originally claimed the land, they made a deal to own half of each other's land. In the event of one of them dying, the other would take over the land. Samuel Hancock came in 1848 and built a wharf and a warehouse on the west side of the inlet. Hancock was an interesting character. First off, he was an explorer. He learned Chinook jargon, the trading language used by the Hudson Bay Company employees for years when trading with the natives. He started to learn it when he heard a minister of a church singing a song with a group of natives. He knew the songs in English, so he learned those words first. Once he was trading with some Lumi natives and was told of black stones at Bellingham Bay. It was the first coal found on the west coast, and it's what built Bellingham. I made a video on Bellingham. If you care to watch it, the link will also be in the description. Edmund Sylvester left for the California Gold Rush of 1849, but due to to health issues, had to return. January 12, 1850, Edmund submitted a plat for the town. He asked Hugh Goldsberg to plat it to resemble a New England village, as they were both from New England. He had to make room for a school, a town square, a Masonic hall. He also included 12 acres for a Capitol building complex. John Swan, who had come to town in 1850 on the Orbit, also helped. He later recalled they used a triangle and a 10-foot pole and a line to plat the town out. He said they made 8 to 10 blocks off of Main Street, now Capitol Way. The blocks were 250 feet and the roads were 60 feet wide. The blocks were 250 square feet and the roads were 60 feet wide. Charles Smith, who owned a store at First and Main, suggested that they call it Olympia as a tribute to the Olympic Mountains. Michael T. Simmons, founder of Newmarket, which became Tumwater, sells his mills and moves to Olympia. He opens a store in the customs building. I would guess his store is on the lower level and the customs business was on the upper floor. He sold the store and went to Shelton in 1853 and built a new mill. Edmund built a log hotel in 1851 called the New England Hotel. It had 2 rooms and was 16 feet long by 24 feet wide, or 384 square feet. Edmund had a bedroom in the hotel, and the rest of the main floor was a kitchen and dining room. The guests would stay in the attic on bunks. He built the hotel next to Levi's old cabin. A post office was built in 1851, but regular mail didn't start until 1852. Michael T. Simmons was the first postmaster. The mail came by horseback and by canoe once a week from the Columbia River. Edmund would let the mail carriers sleep on the dining room floor of his hotel. George A. Barnes opened a general merchandise store in 1851. A lot of their customers were the Squaxin and Nisqually, who would stop with their canoes. There was also a store run by Dr. D.S. Maynard there that year. Doc Maynard bought damaged merchandise from wrecked ships and sold it for half price. His customers loved him, but other store owners didn't, including his future brother-in-law, Michael Simmons. It's said that Simmons got Chief Sealth of the Duwamish to talk the doctor into some other place to set up his store, namely the community up north that became Seattle. So Doc arrived in Seattle in 1852 and was there until his death in 1873. Thurston County was created out of Lewis County in 1852, and their elected coroner was Edmund Sylvester. In 1852, the first public school in Olympia was built at 6th and Franklin. It was a log building that collapsed in 1855 during a snowstorm. The Kendall Company, another general store, opened in 1852, as well as the Olympia Bakery and Beef Market. Also in 1852, the newspaper The Columbian started printing. An interesting story associated with the actual printing press they used. It was built in 1820 and shipped to Mexico to be used by the government there to print pro-government pamphlets. After Mexico won independence from Spain, the press sat until 1834, when it was moved by mule to Monterey, California, where it continued to print Mexican government information. In 1846, when the Americans took over Upper California and arrived in Monterey, they found the press and began California's first newspaper called the Californian. Here's where the story gets crazy. The press then came north to San Francisco and printed the Alta California newspaper, Alta meaning upper. Then it went on to Oregon in 1850 and printed the first newspaper in Oregon called the Oregonian, which is now the oldest operating newspaper west of Salt Lake City, Utah. From there, the old printing press, now 30 years old, went up north some more and found itself in Olympia in 1852. That year it published the first edition of the Columbian newspaper, which was the first paper published in Washington. That paper didn't last long, but the press printed the Washington Pioneer that replaced the Columbian. In 1863, it was on the move again, and it made it up to Seattle. It printed that city's first paper called the Washington Gazette, which became the Seattle Gazette. From 1867 to 1874, it published the Seattle Weekly Intelligencer, which changed its name to the Seattle Post-Intelligence. After its retirement, it was given to the University of Washington Museum. They, in turn, gave it to the Seattle Museum of History and Industry, where it remains as of 2024. In 1853, Washington becomes a territory, separate from Oregon, and newly elected Governor Stevens made Olympia the temporary territorial capital. It's hard to imagine now a town with a population of 100 becoming the capital. The legislature would only meet once a year and was always a big celebration. It was President Franklin Pierce who made Isaac Stevens territorial governor. That's not all the duties the president laid on him. Stevens was also head of the Transcontinental Railroad Survey and superintendent of Indian Affairs. So he had to start a territory and push for statehood while surveying the railroad route and having treaties made up and convincing the natives to sign them and go on to reservations. He arrived in 1853 in Olympia ahead of the rest of his team. He went into the New England hotel, told them that he was hungry, and asked if the dining room could serve him some food. They told him they don't have any time for strangers right now. There's an important guest coming soon. So he asks them just for a snack, which they give him, and he goes outside. Outside, he hears a local talking about how the governor is late. Then he realizes they didn't know he was the governor. That next year, in 1854, his wife and children come to town. A bridge over the Deschutes River was completed in 1853. This now connected Olympia to Tumwater. Also, the New England Hotel was remodeled this year. In 1853, the steamer ferry began making trips to the small community, and from there to Stellicum and then to Seattle. Captain Warren Gove at the helm. John Parker and Henry Coulter opened a store at present-day 222 Capitol Way North in 1853. Edmund Sylvester built the store. This was later turned into the Gold Bar restaurant. Lewis, Moss, and Sig Bettman also came in 1853 and opened a men's clothing store at present-day 312 Capitol Way North. They were the first Jewish settlers and they came from Germany. Later, Lewis took over and moved the store to 410 Capitol Way. Here's a photo of that building in 1885. In 1854, the Treaty of Medicine Creek was signed and put the natives on Squaxin Island Reservation. The descendants of this tribe, as well as other tribes in the area, are now part of the Squaxin tribe. For more information, their tribal center is at 10 Southeast Squaxin Lane, Shelton. In early 1854, Edmund Sylvester left for his hometown in Maine. During his trip, he met Clara. They were married, and she returned with him, both getting back to Olympia in October of 1854. That year, A.B. Stewart started transporting packages between Olympia and Portland. He did this every week for a few years. In June of 1854, Stewart arrived in Olympia, making a record time of 48 hours. Now that trip can be done while doing the speed limit in under 2 hours. A new footbridge connecting Olympia with the east side was finished. That would become 4th Avenue. The Sarah Stone was the first cargo ship to make regular stops at the new town site. Traveled between Olympia, Bellingham, and Fort Victoria, British Columbia. In 1854, the first legislature met upstairs in Parker and Coulter's store. That year, they voted to not grant women the right to vote in the new territory. They also created more counties, appointed state and county officers, and created school districts. We will go over the county and state government history in other videos. Also that year, the Masonic Hall was built. This building would house the next section of the state legislature, and this is where they would vote to keep Olympia as a permanent capital. In 1856, they built a dedicated building for the legislature that was used for the next 50 years. The natives still had a camp at this point at Columbia Street between 3rd and 4th. The second schoolhouse, to replace the one damaged by the snow, was built in 1855. It was a 2-story building completed by John Swan at 6th and Franklin. John had settled the area now known as Swantown. The school was facing 6th, which is now Legion, until 1866 when it was turned to face Franklin Street. Edmund Sylvester had a large home with a 3rd-story tower built on Main Street in 1856. It overlooked the town square. Clara made sure it was a welcoming place for many parties in the town. It was 105 years old when it burned in an arson in 1961 while being renovated. Governor Stevens had a 1-story house with an attic built in 1856 near the present Capitol grounds at 11th and Capitol Way. His son Hazard renovated it in 1920 in hopes to preserve it. Governor Stevens' daughter also wrote a history about the house, trying to keep it preserved. In 1924, they tore it down and ran a sidewalk right through where it was sitting. Now there's a marker for the house and a World War II monument there. Olympia built a blockhouse in the town square portion of town in 1855 as a result of the native wars. All the residents stayed in the blockhouse for 22 months off and on as the war would cool and then get fired up again. They expected to be attacked by Chief Leshi's men at any time, and they had reason to be concerned. They were harboring the governor, who was a wanted man. I will make a video on the Native Settler War of 1854-55 in the future. After the war, the settlers who were still alive and hadn't moved away went back to building a town, county seat, and capital. The natives signed treaties and moved on to reservations. Michael Simmons, founder of Tumwater, became the Indian agent of the area, and he made sure they were all relocated. He moved 460 people to Squaxin and 1,200 people to Fox Island. The remaining native villages in Olympia were gone. The Puget Sound Wesleyan Institute was a Methodist school of higher learning. The Reverend Isaac Dillon and his wife ran the school and built a new building in 1858, 317 Union. Eventually, the school would merge with the University of Puget Sound. In 1858, the territorial legislature incorporated the town of Olympia, making it the first town incorporated in the newly formed Thurston County. That year, the Pacific House Hotel opens at 222 Capitol Way. The Pacific House Hotel and Restaurant was sold in 1859 to Rebecca and Alexander Howard. They renamed it Pacific Hotel and Restaurant. Rebecca was the face of the place and everyone loved her. Many out-of-town politicians would stay there, including one president, Rutherford Hayes, and his wife Lucy. This is the first black-owned business that I could find in Olympia. If there was one sooner, let me know in the comments. Howard Point is named after this family. Thurston County commissioners, who had no permanent building yet, bought the Methodist College building at 200 Union for $1,000 and had it remodeled in 1862 to meet their needs. Now they had a place to carry on essential duties, but they would not be happy there. Edmund and Clara Sylvester had their only child in May of 1864. Her name was Mary Elizabeth, but everyone called her May. She passed away in 1944. The Olympia City Hall was built in 1869. They called it Columbia Hall. Columbia Engine Company No. 1 Fire Department was stationed there as well. They really had a push going to call the town Columbia. It was even voted on a time or two. This building was at 210 4th Avenue. It was used as a city hall, fire station, theater, courthouse until 1912. The Marshville Bridge, also called Long Bridge, was completed sometime in May of 1869 for a total of $5,000. This was a drawbridge over part of Bud's Inlet. The draw had problems though. It took 2 strong men an hour to open it and close it. So in 1872, Mr. Corker of Tumwater proposed a drawbridge that could open in 5 minutes. Corker bid this bridge at $150 and was paid $160. It did open within minutes. The Northern Pacific Railroad was building a line from Kalama to Puget Sound in 1871, and of course, being the capital of Washington State, they would run the train through the capital. If you thought that, you would be wrong, as were many in town who were literally banking on it. They decided to end the train line in Tacoma. Tenino would be Olympia's closest depot. A stage line was used to get to and from Tenino. 1871 brought changes for Thurston County. They were tired of the hill they had to take to get to the courthouse on Union. They didn't like the muddy wooden sidewalks and the ungraded road, and there was a short walk through the woods. It was not located well for them. They leased the old Methodist College to a girls' school. Something must have happened to Mr. Cork's bridge design because in 1873 a new bridge was being built. The old Methodist College on Union was getting new tenants in 1875 when Thurston County traded the school to the school district for their school at 270 Legion Way. The county wanted to be where the action was in town and also closer to their jail. They used the first floor for the clerk's office and jury rooms. The second floor was the courtroom. The school was now called Central School. Governor Stevens' son Hazard Stevens was organizing for a railroad to Tenino to meet with the Northern Pacific. Most people didn't see a need for it. Hazard saw the town was literally being passed by and it would be a matter of time before the capital would be changed to another town. In a hearing on the subject, Dr. Steele, one who most people in town knew for speaking his mind, told the crowd he doesn't see a need for the railroad. If a railroad was built, more doctors would come to the town, and right now, he's the only doctor there and he likes it that way. After that, the people were ready for a railroad and they all got behind the effort. The Long Bridge played a big role after Olympia Tenino Short Line Railroad was completed in 1878. They built the depot on the north side of the bridge so the locomotives didn't have to go through town. That extra attention to the bridge caused it to get weak and it needed renovations in 1880. The Central School on Union had outgrown its building and in 1884 they built an annex building next door that was also 2 stories. By 1885, there were many businesses in Olympia. The Long Bridge was failing once again, and a new bridge was opened in 1888. The dock at the foot of Main Street had been extended in 1887 to 3/4 of a mile long at a cost of $1,200. This allowed ships to be able to tie up any time with any tide. The St. Peter's Hospital was built in 1887. It was located at 1500 Jefferson Street Southeast. The building is now gone. Edmund Sylvester passed away in Seattle in 1887 from wasting disease, probably in a hospital as the newspaper said he'd been struggling with it for some time. Olympia got its first telephone in 1889. The Sunset Telephone Company from San Francisco ran the operation. At the end of the 1880s, what was once Marshville became West Olympia, and the Long Bridge was now called West Side Bridge. Swantown was now called East Olympia, and the Swantown Bridge was now called the East Side Bridge. Can't find a definitive date for that happening. I'm saving those two towns for another video. This video is focused on the main core of Olympia. Olympia Light and Power Company was created in 1890. They built a hydroelectric plant at Tumwater Falls and ran electricity to Olympia. The Olympia Hotel opened near Sylvester Park in 1890. Thurston County built a new courthouse in 1892, the first one built specifically for them. It was and is a beautiful building, located at present-day 600 Washington Street. In 1901, they sold it to the state of Washington to be used as a state capitol until the present-day capitol was opened in 1928. The building is still there, and as of 2024, it is home to the Washington Department of Public Instruction. After the sale of the capitol, Thurston County operated out of a temporary building again at 407 Capitol Way called the McHenry Block. Now it is a parking lot. In 1902, Thurston once again built a new courthouse, this time at 202 4th Avenue East. They were there until 1930. The building was gone and a theater was built in its place. Thomas Agnew built the Star Laundry at 301 North Capitol Way in 1904. This business was eventually taken over by his sons. The building is still there today. Both of the central school buildings on Union were moved a block from Union and Washington to Union and Adams in 1906 by John Moell and his wife so they could build their house there. By 1908, the West Side Bridge had been filled in all the way to its draw span. Also that year, Pacific Telephone and Telegraph from California buys Sunset Telephone, builds a new building at 217 to 223 5th Avenue Southeast. The building is gone, and here's how it looks today. In 1912, a new city hall and fire station was built for the city at 108 State Street Northwest. That building was used for 50 years and is still there today. It replaced Moses Tilley's stable building that had been built in the 1860s. Old Columbia Hall burned in 1914, and a new building called Columbia Building was built in its place. That building remains today. Olympia National Bank was built in 1914 and opened in 1915. It stands today at 422 South Capitol Way. The Northern Pacific, who ended up running the Olympia-Tenino rail line at some point, stopped the route in 1916. Having shared buildings with the elementary schools since the beginning, Olympia finally got a high school built in 1917. Named William Winlock Miller High School. It was named after a pioneer of the city. His wife gave the land that would be used for the school. That land is now a sunken garden at the Capitol complex. The building itself burned in 1918 while a new school was being built across the street. The new high school opened in 1919 at 1125 Washington Street. That building was torn down in 1961. In 1924, the St. Peter's Hospital moved to 420 Sherman Southwest. Now it is an apartment building. Also in 1924, the Pacific Highway was completed. Most of it followed the old military road from Fort Bellingham to Fort Vancouver. Thurston County once again moved in 1931 to 1119 Capitol Way. The building is still there and holds various state offices. Thurston County moved one more time in 1978 to 2000 Lake Ridge Drive, where they're at today. The third, and as of 2024, the final, William Winlock Miller High School was built and opened in 1962 at 1302 North Street Southeast. In 1938, Pacific Telephone moved into a new building called the Fleetwood Building at 119 7th Avenue Southeast. The building is still there, and it's an apartment building as of 2024. Olympia City Hall moved again in 1966 to 900 Plum Street. This building is still there, and as of now, the Justice Center. As of 2024, the current Olympia City Hall, built in 2011, is at 601 4th Avenue. They did a lot of dredging and filling in Olympia in all of those years, enough to fill a video, so I didn't add that into this one. This was just an outline of the early beginnings of this capital town. Videos to come will cover the west and east side as well as Tumwater. I will also make one about the Capitol complex, how it began, and its ascent into what we see today. There will also be a video on the native wars of 1854 and 55, as well as the military road I mentioned and Pacific Highway. So, if you liked the video and you found any value in it, then you know what to do. I would love to hear any comments on Olympia that you may have and what it's meant to you. For some Western Washington history related merchandise, please visit our Etsy store. The link is in the description along with the links to those other videos. Until next time, keep this one thought in mind. Whatever you do today will be history tomorrow. So make it count.